Good morning. We are now ready to start, I believe. Okay. Yes, it's 9 o'clock in the morning in Tokyo, and thank you very much for joining us here today. This is one of the series of the World Bank Group seminars, online seminars, the Tokyo office is organizing. Basically, we do seminars every Friday morning. Occasionally, of course, some special seminars on other days. So we like to start today's seminar that is about the economic outlook. We called it a global economic prospect GEP JEP. This is the most popular product and publications by the World Bank Group, judging from the number of downloads throughout the world. And we are very, very happy that today we are fortunate to have Mr. Ahan Kose, who is the director of the Prospects Group and in charge of production of this report, to join us and make a presentation. And his colleague in his team, Mr. Sugawara Naotaka, he will be making a part of the presentation with Aihan. Sugawara-san, よろしくお願いします。And we are also very, very, very happy and privileged to have Professor Shirai, Sayuri Shirai, as the commentator for today's session. And as you know, Professor Shirai is a very well-known figure in the field of finance, international finance and international economy. And of course, she has a very long career at the BOJ, IMF, and Keio University at the moment. So without further ado, I would like to jump into the seminar. And the seminar, as I said, was about the economic outlook. Now we are hopefully seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, particularly for those countries with vaccination rollout has progressed to a certain degree. Japan is perhaps lagging slightly behind compared to other advanced economies. But if you look at the world, and particularly in the poor segment of the countries, they are still struggling with the infection cases, and meaningful vaccine rollout has been very, very slow in these countries. And Aihan and Mr. Sugawara will talk about what impact and what implication that would have to their economic prospect. So I would like to invite Aihan and Sugawara-san for their presentation. And after that, I would like to ask Professor Shirai to comment on the presentation. Following that, I'd like to open the floor for your questions. And if you use the chat function of the YouTube Live, we will be able to pick up your questions, collect them, and ask these questions to any of the speakers. So thank you very much. And Aihan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Masato. Let me thank you, Koichi, and your staff in Tokyo, representing us extremely well and always hosting us for this event. It is an important platform to come to Tokyo for us and present it in front of the audience. And I'm saying everybody good morning. Obviously, we are in Washington, D.C. now, and it's in the evening here. It's always a pleasure, and I'm hoping that we will come and visit sooner than later. That's always my hope. The report we released last week looks at the global economy, the regional economy. What now and I will do, provide a taste of this report. Let me quickly share the presentation. I hope you all can see the presentation. Everybody can see the presentation? So one important milestone with this report is that it is the 30th anniversary of the global economic prospects. 30 years ago, in 1991, global economy was experiencing a deep recession. That recession had its roots in financial sector challenges, but of course created all types of problems around the world. In the midst of that recession, the World Bank released the first issue of the Global Economic Prospects report. Prior to that, the report had a long history. In the 70s, 80s, there were sections basically featured in the World Development Report. And then in 1991, they were all combined into Global Economic Prospects when it comes to the outlook. Today, now and I will cover prospects. The report has the usual global outlook and regional outlooks. And then there are three analytical pieces. The first piece looks at the growth scenarios, the beyond 2021. Another one looks at the elevated trade costs, what are the causes and remedies. And the third one looks at emerging inflation pressures, whether these are cause for concern from the perspective of emerging market and developing economies. We structure our presentation around four questions. The first one is, what are near-term prospects for the global economy? The second one, what are the implications of emerging inflation pressures? The third one, what are the implications of these high trade costs we are observing around the world? And the fourth one, what are policy priorities? Throughout the presentation, we are going to use this acronym, EMDs, Emerging Market and Developing Economies. I am going to cover for the first three questions, and now is going to tell us the important policy challenges and then the priorities. Let me start with the first question. What are near-term prospects for the global economy? Now, when you look at the global backdrop for emerging market developing economies, you see that this is a still quite benign environment. Global trade has been rebounding rapidly. In fact, goods trade went back to the pre-crisis levels in a much shorter time period than what we observed during the global financial crisis. Of course, the services trade got a big hit during the pandemic, but still services trade also coming back and only 3% below pandemic levels in March 2021, if you look at the kind of the high frequency indicators. If you look at the financial conditions, they remain quite accommodative. So the portfolio inflows to emerging market developing economies were somewhat tepid, but at least, you know, we didn't see the type of outflows we saw earlier in the year because of the elevated inflation concerns. In the case of commodity prices, we saw something remarkable after these prices collapsed during the pandemic. They basically roared back, and when you look at, for example, the metals prices, some of them broke, of course, the records in terms of increases as activity came back. There was robust demand from China, and there were supply disruptions in some major producers. Oil prices have recovered with global demand, and of course, the agricultural prices also saw significant increase relative to last year, March. Against this backdrop, we are forecasting global growth to be 5.6% this year. This is a very strong rebound, and it is also historically critical record when we think about the history of the global economy over a long time period. In fact, this will be the fastest growth the global economy is going to deliver in nearly 50 years. And it is the fastest recovery following a recession in more than 80 years, since the late 1930s. And we are going to see actually the fastest per capita growth in 70 years, since the late 1940s. And as you can see here, it's 1.5 percentage points above what we were expecting in January. So far so good. You see the very sharp rebound in activity, record growth number. The big problem is that this is not a evenly distributed growth performance. It is the tale of two recoveries. On the one side, you have advanced economies. They are going to deliver growth of 5.4%, a significant upgrade relative to our January forecast. A big chunk of this growth is going to come from the US. We are expecting the US economy to grow close to 7%, the highest growth the US is going to deliver since mid-1980s. China is going to deliver growth 8.5%, which is another very strong print. When you look at emerging market developing economies, the 6% number we are forecasting this year also looks quite robust relative to what happened prior to the crisis, the average growth 4.5%. But there, a big chunk of that 6% number is coming from China. If you take out China, the number goes down to less than 4.5%. And when you look at the regions, of course, East Asia and Pacific is doing well at the back of China. Latin America and the Caribbean is able to deliver strong growth, not strong enough to compensate the deep recession the region experienced. But you look at a region like Sub-Saharan Africa, the growth is less than 3%, and that number is not enough. We did not upgrade our growth number for the region. In fact, we downgrade the growth for next year. So there is, if you see, basically two-speed recovery. There are countries that are basically recovering at a rapid pace, and those that are lagging behind. Now, there are different ways of thinking about this two-speed recovery. So there is no question this is the strongest global rebound after a global recession since the late 30s, early 40s. When you have these types of global recessions, what happens within 2 years? Around 75% countries, advanced economies, emerging developing economies, they recover and they go back to their pre-global recession per capita income levels. Now, in this global recession, we are expecting at the end of 2022, almost all advanced economies are going to go back to pre-global recession per capita income levels. But in the case of emerging market developing economies, about 1/3 of them are going to do that. And the other big chunk would basically lag, delay their recoveries. Now, why is this happening? Of course, this is happening because these advanced economies were able to implement a wide range of large-scale fiscal monetary policy measures, the credit easing measures. And they have been very active in terms of vaccinating their populations. They have done that at a rapid clip. And what you see on the chart on the right panel is that when we look at these forecast revisions, in fact, we basically upgraded our forecasts in those countries that were able to deliver speedy vaccination. And when we upgraded our forecasts in those countries, they were basically late or slow in terms of delivering vaccines. Those upgrades were small. And in the case of course, emerging market developed economies, we ended up downgrading growth outcomes. We think that this is a big, big problem for the global economy. The reason is that when you don't have enough growth, of course, you are unable to generate per capita income growth. And per capita income growth is critical for emerging market developed economies and their ability to go to the income levels of advanced economies. Narrowing down the income levels with advanced economies is only possible if emerging developed economies deliver much faster growth rates than advanced economies. So in these figures, what you see is what happened prior to the crisis and what we are thinking that's going to happen during the next 3 years. So if you look at low-income countries, for example, prior to the crisis, the growth differential with advanced economies was very small, actually. But now, for the next 3 years, we are expecting advanced economies per capita growth to be around 2 percentage points higher than low-income countries. In the case of fragile conflict states, that number is around 4 percentage points. Small states, a number of them rely on tourism revenues, got a big hit. And of course, the members of international development associations, these IDA countries, are also lagging behind when it comes to their convergence process, their catch-up process. When you look at different regions of the world, you see a striking outcome. In the case of East Asia, South Asia, you see positive growth numbers still there in terms of their per capita differential with advanced economies. But when you look at Latin America, Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, you see something quite remarkable. These economies on average did not converge to advanced economies during the past decade, and they are going to actually move away from the income levels of advanced economies in the first 3 years of this decade. So we have a very serious problem in front of us, even though we see this very sharp rebound in the global economy. The poorest countries, the countries they need the growth most, are not delivering the type of growth necessary for them to close the income gap with advanced economies. This mixed growth outlook also comes with risks that are still on the downside. We are worried about these, of course, the outbreaks in emerging market developed economies. Some of them were quite heavy, as you observe in South Asia, now Latin America, in some parts of Asia as well. So it's going to be critical to basically push the vaccine rollout as soon as possible. And the single most important risk confronting the global recovery is the delays in vaccination campaigns in emerging developing economies. Another important risk is associated with financial market stress that could be because of reassessment of inflation expectations or growth prospects or corporate defaults because elevated levels of corporate debt. Of course, we already have elevated levels of sovereign debt. Food insecurity is a serious problem. In some parts of the world, geopolitical risks are there, and there are serious climate-related risks. There are also some upside risks. For example, if we are able to end the pandemic faster than expected because of the speedy vaccination deployment, that could even lead to higher growth, which we examine in the report. There are also growth outcomes associated with these large positive spillovers from major economies translating into a synchronized global boom. And that's the kind of the hope we have. Now, let me turn to the second question. What are the implications of emerging inflation pressures? Now, here, there is no question. Inflation is on the rise. And this is what you expect when you have a global recession. Last year, inflation declined between January and May 2020. Consumer price inflation slowed by about 0.9 percentage points as global demand and oil prices collapsed. This decline was about 1/3 more pronounced in inflation in advanced economies than in emerging market developing economies. What was interesting is that in every global recession, of course, inflation tends to decline if these demand forces dominate. In this case, inflation declined again, but it was the smallest decline we observe in a global recession. Since May 2020, inflation has picked up and picked up at a rapid rate. By April 2021, inflation had risen above pre-pandemic levels in both advanced economies and emerging market and developing economies. And this increase was basically broad-based. As you can see on the right, when you look at the output prices in both advanced economies and emerging market developing economies, these are high-frequency indicators, there are continued plans to raise prices. That means the inflation pressures are going to be with us for the foreseeable future. So we had this rather extraordinary period last year. We saw the smallest decline in inflation during a global recession. You might say that was because we started at a much lower inflation rate than what we saw in previous global recessions in earlier decades. But then we saw the fastest increase in inflation following a global recession. So there are serious concerns about inflationary pressures. There is large pent-up demand. Of course, there are supply disruptions, and there are challenges putting pressure on inflation because of what we see in commodity markets. So the commodity prices increasing have implications for headline inflation. What we did in the report, we used an econometric model to look at the implications of recent developments for inflation this year. Our model-based estimates point to an increase in annual average global inflation by about 1.4 percentage points from 2020 to 2021. And when you look at the consensus forecast, inflation expectations for this year, you also see an increase in inflation by about 1 percentage points. If inflation increases about 1.4 percentage points, that would raise inflation above inflation target ranges in some emerging market developing economies that are targeting inflation. But that does not necessarily warrant a policy response, provided that inflation increase is temporary and inflation expectations are well anchored. And when you look at inflation expectations, whether you look at advanced economy inflation expectations, whether you look at emerging market developing economy inflation expectations, they do appear to remain well anchored. Yes, surveys-based inflation expectations have picked up in advanced economies and EMDs, but only for this year. If you look at 5 years ahead, they remain remarkably stable, as you see in these panels. So there are, of course, questions about these structural factors that basically pushed inflation down for several decades and how those factors would change. But in all likelihood, those changes are going to be gradual, not basically in a very rapid way. Beyond these inflation concerns, there are serious problems in food markets, as many countries, low-income economies, are facing a serious challenge in terms of providing food to their populations. Food price inflation has increased during the pandemic, and as you can see on the left chart, especially low-income countries, because of the increase in food prices, low-income country inflation, in fact, continue increasing last year. And you see on the left, this wasn't the case for non-low-income country, emerging market, developing economies. Why this is a big problem? Because the food accounts for a large chunk of imports, and it accounts for, of course, a large chunk of consumer price index. In other words, in these economies, you see the consumption basket has a large food component that's expected because of the kind of the low income levels, and they are importing food from the rest of the world, and that also because of exchange rate movements, in some cases depreciations, putting pressure on food prices. Food insecurity, in terms of having access to food, has increased quite significantly relative to where it was in 2018. And this is something global community needs to pay attention to in terms of providing food, in terms of helping these countries. These countries also need to make sure they are not, in a sense, implementing policies that will backfire, putting price controls or putting, if they are food exporters, the export of food items and trying to basically, in a sense, control markets that will, if implemented by multiple countries, translate into a higher food price inflation. So the right thing to do is to find ways to strengthen social safety nets and increase access to food. This is easier said than done. That's why it is very important for the global community to provide help in this context. Let me quickly talk about this other analytical chapter we have, the trade costs. As you know, prior to the global financial crisis, we saw trade growing around 4%, 6% on average from 1970 to 2008. This was a much higher number than output growth number. Over the past decade, still trade growth was higher than the growth of output, but not much higher. And the trade, long-run trade elasticities, when you look at them, how the trade is responding to changes in income, has declined relative to where they were from 1990 to 2011. And then, of course, the past decade, you see it in the right panel. So trade growth slowed, our trade response to basically the output slowed as well. And this is a big problem because trade has been seen as an engine of growth and has helped reducing poverty in a number of emerging developing economies. These trade costs we examine involve all types of costs that basically affect cross-border movement of goods. And they are very high. In fact, because of trade costs, international traded goods are 2 times higher than domestically traded goods. And they are much higher in emerging market developing economies than advanced economies. Some regions have higher trade costs than others, for example, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And when we think about the trade costs, the first thing we think about tariff rates. But tariff rates account for only 7% of these costs. A big chunk of these costs are associated with shipping connectivity and logistics. So relative to 2008, emerging market developing economies have been able to reduce their trade costs, but still these costs are significantly higher than what we see in advanced economies. There are different reasons why we see this higher cost and different reasons why we saw trade costs going down over the past decade. One reason is connectivity. Basically, you have the infrastructure to move goods from inlands to the ports, and then, of course, to other parts of the world. Another reason, costs associated with trade policy. Some countries have more restrictive trade policies, and regulations at the border, the costs associated with trade facilitation. So trade is an important engine of growth, and nowadays we are looking around to find ways to promote economic growth. We would like to have that trade to be the engine again, and countries can undertake policies to have that engine available. Here, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Naotaka Sugawara, to tell us about the policy priorities as we think about this rather the challenging recovery ahead of us. Now?
Okay. Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Ivan. Everyone hear me? Okay. So the last question we answer in this presentation about policies, as I have mentioned. So what are the policy priorities and what is the important policies in there? The answer is these pandemic issues are the first, and then policies need to support economic recoveries, but make sure that there are no problems in inflation and fiscal sustainability. And then recovery should be green, resilient, and inclusive. It can be achieved by implementing reforms. As I just mentioned, the first step is ending the pandemic. Acceleration of the pace of vaccine deployment is a key factor. Production and distribution of vaccines can be improved through international cooperation, especially to countries vaccine availability is quite limited. The next step is policymakers need to strike a balance between pursuing economic recovery with maintaining macroeconomic stability. The balance is, of course, both on the fiscal and monetary policy front. For these both policies, the timing matters. The policymakers should avoid undercutting fragile recoveries with a too quick withdrawal of policy support. But eventually, keeping policy support will bring issues to rising fiscal vulnerabilities and inflationary pressures, and they will need to be addressed. In addition, to prepare for further unexpected shocks, credible policy frameworks need to be maintained. For smaller emerging market and developing economies and low-income countries, especially countries with liquidity and solvency problem for now, international debt relief and any other financial support are critical. And then finally, policymakers can help shape the recovery by implementing reforms to put the recovery on the path to green, resilient, and inclusive development. This requires investing in capital, especially human capital, and dealing with labor market issues. So these reforms should also be to lower trade costs, as I have stressed, improve digital connectivity, and address informal economy. The recovery should reverse the damage from the pandemic, reduce poverty and inequality, and help address the challenges of climate change. In the next, I will further discuss some of the policy challenges mentioned here. So as policy options to lower trade costs, there's a wide range of measures as presented here. They include measures to ease trading across border, to increase logistic performance, to raise shipping connectivity, and to reduce tariffs. Trade agreement to deepen international integration can also help lower non-tariff barriers, shipping connectivity and trade across border have improved over time, as shown in this slide. But there is still scope to enhance these measures, particularly in emerging market and developing economies when compared with advanced economies. Logistic performance can also be improved further, since there's a limited progress that have been made since 2007. In addition, tariffs remain elevated, especially in the agriculture sector. Trade costs can be lowered most effectively through comprehensive reform packages. So our analysis in the report suggests that trade costs in emerging market and developing economies with poor performance in these measures could be reduced by half if they improve shipping connectivity, logistics, and border processes to the level in best performing emerging market and developing economies. So I will discuss two additional challenges here. The first one is about the left chart, balancing fiscal support with the fiscal sustainability. And then the second one is on the right chart about green investment. Fiscal support measures last year were sizable, and we saw large increases in fiscal deficit and debt. As a result, fiscal space has been shrunk significantly, and sustainability has been an issue to be discussed on the table. Under this circumstance, shifting spending to the areas with a greater effect on future growth is a key option to take. For example, investing in education can mitigate the disruption to human capital caused by the pandemic. At the same time, gaps in investment needs in education can be addressed through broadening domestic revenue mobilization to raise funding. Another example is infrastructure spending. The expenditure to support digital transformation will expand access to digital connectivity and can contribute to higher productivity. Of course, in these policy efforts, fiscal credibility is significantly important. Those credibility can be obtained through medium-term fiscal frameworks, delivering clear policy direction, and transparency. Regarding green investment, there is tremendous scope to improve environmental performance and reduce greenhouse gas emissions through green investment in emerging market and developing economies. This requires attracting private investment through a supportive domestic environment, which includes an effective regulatory environment and sound financial system. Ensuring that infrastructure is resilient to climate change is also critical, particularly for small island states. Back to Ayhan.
Thank you. Now, let me summarize what we said in our presentation today. The first question we asked, what are near-term prospects for the global economy? We are seeing the strongest global growth following a global recession in the past 8 decades, but emerging market developing economy per capita incomes lagging behind. Risks are still tilted to the downside. Second, we looked at the implications of emerging inflation pressures. Inflation pickup may be temporary and not necessarily warrant a policy response in emerging market developing economies, but may complicate their policy choices. Going forward, these economies need to carefully adjust their monetary and financial policies depending on inflation developments abroad as well as at home. The third issue, we examined the implications of high trade costs. The trade has been in the back burner for a while. We are hoping that now it's going to get the attention it deserves. Trade costs double the price of traded goods over domestic goods, but it's possible to reduce them by about 50% if countries lower shipping, logistic costs, and streamline border processes. Finally, what are the policy priorities? As now mentioned, the single most important policy priority is to control the pandemic. We need to vaccinate everybody everywhere as quick as possible to basically minimize these local outbreaks and make sure we have a healthy global population and healthy global economy in terms of growth outcomes evenly distributed. This is a period for policymakers. It's going to be important to support the recovery while safeguarding price stability and fiscal sustainability. And that's a difficult task to manage. It will require a lot of calibration. Finally, policymakers need to look at the medium to long term and internalize the realities of climate change and need to ensure a green, resilient, and inclusive recovery. Let me thank again for joining us today. We have a number of publications on our webpage. We would like to invite you all to visit the webpage. In addition to global economic prospects, we have this periodical publication, Commodity Markets Outlook. Of course, every month we have a publication about the state of the global economy, providing a snapshot of what is going on. And we recently released this book on this important issue, informality, already presented in Tokyo. Let me stop here. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion and the questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayhan. Thank you very much, Mr. Sugawara. You have put before us, as always, many important questions and observations, both in the conjuncture parts as well as in the analytical parts. Much food for thought. So I would like to invite Professor Shirai to comment on the presentation made by Ayhan and Mr. Sugawara, and followed by questions and answer session. So Professor Shirai, if you're ready, please begin your comment.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we do. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, the World Bank and Miyazaki-san and Omori-san for asking me to be a discussant. And also, I really enjoyed the presentation. It was very good, very detailed, and I fully agree with the analysis and sort of policy recommendations suggested by two presenters. So what I will do is I like to provide some kind of supplementary information to what the previous presenters described. So in the chapter 1, the World Bank discussed that world economic recovery is exceptionally strong, and the economic growth rate is projected to reach 5.6%, strongest post-recession pace in 80 years. And especially advanced economies are recovering faster than emerging and developing economies, and perhaps partly due to unequal access to vaccine. The recovery is expected to be strongest in Asia, primarily due to the strength in China. Low-income economies face difficult policy challenges, this is in my view, between supporting the recovery through fiscal stimulus and ensuring fiscal sustainability, as well as between continuing monetary easing and achieving price stability. How to achieve a green, resilient, and inclusive development path is also more challenging in EMDE than in advanced economies. So let's look at the real GDP growth rate in 2019 and 2020. And the countries highlighted with red underline is referring to the advanced economy, and the black underline is referring to the some emerging economies. So when we look at the advanced economy and emerging economy, it looks like an Asian emerging economy is doing well they had a very high economic growth in 2019, and in 2020, they had a small negative economic growth. So Asia looks like doing much better than any other region and any other advanced economies. However, as presenter suggested, once we look at each countries, many Asian emerging economies suffered quite a lot. And because they had a very high economic growth in 2019, and they had a very sharp negative growth in 2020, so I think this the magnitude of this economic shock generated in the emerging economy was much greater compared to the advanced economy. So when you look at this chart, look at China, and China, is accounting for 70% of emerging Asia, and they achieved a positive economic growth in 2019-20. So once we exclude China, many emerging economies suffered a lot. This is just based on a nominal GDP, and please look at the right-hand side, EMDE, and then we exclude China. And once we exclude China, many emerging developing countries suffered a lot. And so they experienced very deep negative economic growth last year. So let's look at the government total spending as a percent of GDP in 2019 and 2020. And you can see, as presenters suggested, the advanced economies on the left-hand side, they were able to increase the government spending to cope with COVID-19. So the scale of this increase in spending as a percent of GDP was much larger in advanced economy, but in emerging economy, please look at the right-hand side, the increase was small. As a result, the fiscal balance, the deficit deteriorated, in a greater scale among advanced economy left-hand side, but the emerging economy on the right-hand side, the magnitude of spending was relatively limited. So deterioration of fiscal deficit was relatively mild compared to advanced economies. Let's look at quickly about monetary easing. As you know, since the COVID-19, additional advanced economies such as Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Canada, but also several emerging economies adopted quantitative easing. So meaning purchases the government bond and other financial assets. And a very interesting thing is that many Asian and other emerging economies adopted quantitative easing, even though they haven't reached the zero lower bound. So except Australia, New Zealand, Canada, many countries still had a positive policy interest rate, but they introduced the quantitative easing. Now, so what are the benefits of quantitative easing for the emerging economies? Why they introduced it? Because their bond market started to get destabilized. So they needed to restore the financial market. And also by having quantitative easing, many emerging economies can lower the benchmark bond yield, and thus being able to lower the cost of capital for household and firms. However, several research papers are also suggesting quantitative easing benefit are rather limited relative to advanced economy because many emerging economies, their transmission channel is constrained by less developed financial and capital market. And also they didn't do massive quantitative easing, partly because they are worried about depreciation, and especially for large foreign debt economies. So let's look at the magnitude of a sort of quantitative easing. The right-hand side showing some emerging economy which conducted this quantitative easing. So this is just the size of size of asset purchases as a percent of GDP. So most of the economies, the scale of increase was between 0 to 9% of GDP. Look at the left-hand side. Japan, balance sheet expanded about 24% of GDP just after the COVID-19. US 17% of GDP, Euro area 20%. So no comparison. The scale of quantitative easing was much greater in advanced economy than in emerging economy. Just to conclude my point in this chart. So some EMDE, QE was used as a supplementary tool, even though their policy rate remained above zero. The scale of QE was limited in EMDE due to one, small size of debt market, and two, some concerns over depreciation, and three, concerns over borrowing and capital flow and reversal. As quantitative easing was greater in higher income economies and their yield remained lower, EMDE avoided sharp capital outflow and therefore avoided sharp exchange rate depreciation. The relationship between monetary easing and fiscal policy remained more indirect and could be less persistent in EMDE. The arguments such as monetary financing with debt or closer policy coordination remain more applicable to advanced economy. So this is chapter 1. Let me quickly move to the chapter 3. So in this report, the World Bank mentioned about the trade cost, and then trade costs remain high and then double the cost of domestic goods in the emerging developing countries due to tariff, shipping and logistics, and cumbersome trade procedures. And so they propose the reform is needed to deepen the trade liberalization and so on. It's not directly related to your presentation, but if possible, I'd like to get your comment about global supply chain. So since the pandemic, it looks like a China-centered global supply chain network strengthened, in my view. But can we? So what is your view? The China-centered global supply chain network strengthened or diverged? The second question is, how will U.S. policy to strengthen its manufacturing sector and create own supply chain network influence the current network? How will Asian suppliers cope with this network? As you suggested, trade costs are higher in emerging and developing economies. But as a result of having a new form of global supply chain centered in the United States, creates some kind of inefficiency, right? So national security concerns are more important than comparative advantage or cost effect. So what will happen to these Asian suppliers whose trade costs are much higher? Let's quickly look at this is China's trade, the export and imports, and rapidly growing, especially after COVID-19, both export and import. And this is China's share as a percent of total export share, and China's export rapidly increased partly because of supply of medical product, but also IT product and so on. So it looks like China is strengthening their advantage and comparative advantage in supply chain. But also they increase the share of China increased the share of import in total import. And because of that, a country like Japan or Germany and manufacturing country benefited a lot because China is the country which are able to import lots of product from other countries. So this is my question to presenters. Finally, let me briefly point out my view about inflationary pressure in emerging economy. So as you suggested, no doubt, globally, inflation is picking up. But in addition to that, as you suggested, in developing and emerging economy, food prices are also picking up. So inflationary pressure appears to be a bit higher in emerging and developing country and than advanced economy. Now, I think it's really, we have to look at how US monetary policy will perform. As yesterday, Fed decided to change their projection. So before they were thinking to raise the federal fund rate beyond 2013, but yesterday they said within 2013, because the inflationary pressure was bigger than they thought. So as a result, slightly, the US interest rate rose, 10-year yield, and also US dollar index picked up slightly. So, nobody knows how successful US monetary policy will be, because the Fed introduced average inflation targeting last year, and then nobody knows how successful this policy will be. As a result, US debt is also growing. If the US interest rate starts to pick up, maybe emerging economy have to also increase the interest rate. And that may have a downward pressure on the economy, but also if the US dollar index starts to pick up, that means a depreciation in the emerging economy, which gives additional upward pressure on the inflation. So, if you can give any comment about how you see the US monetary policy and how that will influence emerging economies. Finally, very quickly about climate issue. Everybody knows we need to achieve green recoveries. But when you look at the emerging economy, let's look at Asia, like India, Indonesia, but also Japan. They are depending on coal because coal fuel is cheapest. And so if we are going to ask them to shift into the renewable energy, utilities, and and how are they going to do it? So they have to eliminate subsidy provided to the fossil fuel, and probably they have to introduce carbon pricing, right? How are they going to finance it? In advanced economy, we charge to the utility prices, so consumer pay for that. But in an emerging and developing country, that can be very, very detrimental to the household consumption. So if the World Bank can provide some prescription how to achieve the green recovery in emerging economy, will be very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shirai. Very insightful, great questions. Particularly, I personally learned a lot from your commentary slides regarding QE in emerging markets. That was very interesting, and of course, your questions on U.S. monetary policy was very, very timely. Okay, so I shall ask Aihan and Sugawara-san to answer and to the questions and comments from Professor Shirai, please. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Masato, and let me thank Dr. Shirai joining us again, and it's wonderful to share the stage with her and really providing this very insightful discussion. Let me quickly discuss some of the issues Dr. Shirai raised. The first one and the second one were about trade-related issues, so I'm going to briefly talk about those. Her first question, how do we see the China-centered global supply chain network, whether it's strengthened or diverged? The truth is, Dr. Shirai, it's not straightforward to answer these questions because official data on global value chain participation are only available with long lags. But data on trade in intermediate goods, which can serve as a rough proxy for engagement in global value chains, point to an overall resilience of global supply chains in the wake of the pandemic. Intermediate goods trade fell sharply in the first quarter of 2020 amid a steep decline in Chinese exports and imports. But the rebound was quick, with the recovery in China driving a pickup in this category already in the second quarter of 2020. Having said that, supply chain pressures were felt around the world in the mid 2020 as countries basically really scoured for masks and medical products. Shortage of other goods like semiconductor chips still exists today. A recent survey by the World Bank, these are the Global Pulse surveys, and I invite everybody to visit our web pages to look at these surveys. They suggest that in the face of COVID-19 shocks, multinational corporations are looking to enhance diversification of suppliers and production sites rather than reshoring production. And if you look at the China-centered supply chains, anecdotal evidence suggests that some companies indeed shifted towards secondary and tertiary supply chains in Southeast Asia. However, these seem to be the exceptions rather than the rule. And there are different surveys actually done in Japan, done in Germany, even in the context of US companies, all suggesting resilience of basically the supply chains in Asia. Your second question also very, I think, pointed and timely. How should we think about the kind of the recent developments in the US in terms of strengthening its manufacturing sector and creating own supply chain network? Implications of this for Asian suppliers. At the end of the day, I think we need to really carefully study this report, understand the kind of the implementation, because some of these things, as much as suggestive, will require carefully thought out policies. I think what we know, there's a strong interest in strengthening the resilience of supply chains, something policymakers around the world, including in the European Union, also share. While we welcome the greater resilience of supply chains, these initiatives do not necessarily mean that we are at the beginning of a large wave of onshoring or reshoring of supply chains. Indeed, resilience can be enhanced through greater diversification and reliance on digitalization as well. And this seems to be what most multinational corporations are planning at the moment. And here, I think we shouldn't forget the benefits that are associated with trade and supply chains in terms of productivity and income growth. There's a difficult balancing act for policymakers, difficult balancing act, striking a balance between enhancing trade openness and integration while increasing the resilience in the face of potential supply chain shocks. The debate how to achieve this is very much open. In the JEP, we are making, I think, a very simple point. There are low-hanging fruits out there in terms of lowering trade costs. Some of these costs countries can lower at the border by reducing the red tape, reducing the bureaucracy, and basically promoting growth of trade. Your second question is about the monetary policy in the United States. How do we expect down the road? Let me also tell you that I greatly appreciated your discussion of QE policies in emerging developing economies. This is something we examined in our January report, and our conclusions were quite similar to yours. These types of policies, on the surface, they look quite attractive, but how effective they are, always a question because of the strength of the transmission channel, and there could be some risks associated with them if basically countries use the primary markets to finance their budget deficits. Of course, there could be a wide range of side effects associated with these policies. Going back to U.S. monetary policy, I think at this junction, it's important to realize in the U.S. monetary policy framework was changed recently. In the past, there was, in a sense, a forward-looking policy framework focused on a certain inflation number. Now, the the policymakers would like to think about what will be the average inflation for an extended period of time, and think about whether they can basically let the economy to overshoot, heat a little bit. You can be above the inflation target, and then, if necessary, you intervene. In the meantime, as Fed policymakers repeatedly mentioned, they would like to pay attention to developments in U.S. labor markets. They would like to see U.S. labor markets to, in a sense, normalize and get to a point there is the kind of the sufficient activity supported by vibrant labor market. So there are these concerns about inflation. Those concerns are rightly placed. Our analysis suggests that this inflation spike, in all likelihood, is going to be temporary. We are not going back to 70s. We might see higher inflation next year. In all likelihood, we will see higher inflation this year relative to last year. But then, of course, the growth will moderate. Supply shortages will be addressed. In fact, we might have the excess supply at some point. And of course, the commodity prices will also adjust as growth dynamics change. Your third question is very critical: how emerging developed economies can implement these green policies given the constraints they have. There are three important points. The first point is that in a number of countries, because of the pandemic associated disruption, there is need for significant investment in many areas. These economies need to build and hopefully build better in fashion. So there is an opportunity here. As much as we had a tragic episode, and we are still experiencing this episode in some parts of the world, there is an opportunity here to be, intelligent when we undertake infrastructure investment, when we undertake investment in other parts, and we are adjusting these economies to keep in mind the kind of the climate-related constraints. Second, the constraints you mentioned are there. In a number of countries, energy is not cheap. In some cases, it's coming from polluted, polluting sources, including coal. But somehow the transition has to start from somewhere. In some of these countries, there are cheaper ways to think. And there are, of course, jobs associated with these green industries. And the third point, and probably the most important one, the pandemic showed us one important reality. There are tail risks confronting the global economy. And those tail risks can materialize. And when they can materialize, they can really have damaging implications. And these are not just economic implications, these are health, life-related implications. And in some parts of the world, we are already seeing how climate change creating the type of damage with wide-ranging implications. So the reality is that as much as it's going to be difficult, policymakers need to start from somewhere. As much as it's going to be expensive, they need to, think through what types of policies they are going to implement to adjust their economies. And there is no question, these economies have to lead the way and help emerging market developing economies. And that's the kind of the big challenge nowadays as we formulate our policies. What's the role of the global community? What's the role of these national governments? How they are going to meet their, commitments in the context of climate? There are a number of global initiatives in play, and we are actively participating these. But let me again thank you for your questions. I hope I address all of them. I'm very happy to engage with you again. Masato, back to you.
Thank you, Dahan. Mr. Sugawara, do you have anything to add to Aihan's comment?
No, I think he did everything.
Okay. And Professor Shirai, would you like to respond?
No, it's okay. I
Okay.
basically agree, so that's fine.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a very productive dialogue here. So I would like to turn to the audience who have been watching these exchanges. And I would like to invite my colleague, Mr. Koichi Omori, to share with us the questions we've already received. So Mr. Omori, please come in.
Thank you, Mr. Miyazaki. My name is Koichi Omori. I'm Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We received several questions from the audience in advance, and also some questions we received during the presentation. So let me introduce those questions. First one, a question from Mori-san. Thank you very much for your question. Presuming the pace of the vaccine rollout goes smoothly in sub-Saharan Africa, what would be the major bottlenecks for African countries to continue and accelerate their economic growth? And how would you advise the leaders in Africa? That's the first question. Let me go to the second question. Tanaka-san, thank you very much. How do you please touch on how the new report discusses the role of science, technology, and innovation in emerging market and developing countries? So that's the second question. And third question we received from Professor Hideaki Hirata from the Hosei University during the presentation. Thank you for your question. Trade output ratio shown in the last part of Aihan's presentation suggests that so-called economic globalization had slowed down a bit as compared to the 1990s and 1980s. In particular, the development of supply chain networks for the last few decades suggests that gross trade data would overestimate the size of trade integration. Two questions. First, do you have any idea what are behind of this change in the trend of economic globalization through international trade? And second, is there any possibility that demand spillover effect from the advanced economies with quicker vaccination to EMDEs get limited due to this trend? So these are the points raised by Professor Hirata. So with those questions and points, I would like to pass the microphone back to Masato. Thank you.
Thank you, Omori-san. Aihan, could you respond to these questions?
I think this time now is going to start with the question on Africa now.
Yeah, sure. We'll answer this bottlenecks for growth in sub-Saharan Africa. And thank you for the question. It's a very important question, especially for these policies. So in this presentation, we presented 3 steps of policy priorities. And then the question assuming the first step of preventing the pandemic, the vaccine deployment was going to be very smooth. So the second step is a balancing between policies, growth, and any policy problems. So in sub-Saharan Africa countries, fiscal problem is going to be a major one. So in order to maintain, in order to secure growth in these economies, fiscal problem need to be, fiscal sustainability issues need to be solved. In order to do that, we presented increasing the efficiency of the spending. So shifting from inefficient part to efficient side of the expenditures. That's one thing that we can think as a bottleneck to secure this. But most importantly, is the reform effort is going to be the major bottlenecks in sub-Saharan Africa. We presented the trade cost section. In sub-Saharan Africa, the trade costs are still very high. And then, as Aihan mentioned, there's a report on the informality we just published in last month. It's discussing that widespread informal economy in sub-Saharan Africa So those structural issues need to be addressed through structural reforms, including improving the business environment, improving labor market flexibility, and of course, lowering trade costs, and then reducing widespread inequality. Those are the policy advices that we can think for the sub-Saharan Africa. But of course, it depends upon country context. So we need to be tailor those policy message to each country. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you. Now, I think in the case of Africa, as you said, the fiscal is critical. In some of these countries, we have a serious problem that needs to be addressed. Global community needs to be engaged. We have common framework in place. Some of these countries are already going through common framework, and we are hoping that with our work with the IMF, these countries are going to restructure their debt and go back to sustainable debt profiles and sustained growth with reduction in poverty. Now, let me turn to the second question. How the new report discusses the role of science, technology, and innovation in emerging market and developing economies. So the way we think about the role of science, technology, and innovation is this the kind of the point we are making. The long-term growth prospects today are basically darker than what we had prior to the pandemic. We are expecting potential growth to decline. It was something we expected before the pandemic. Now we are expecting that decline is going to be larger. Of course, there are different ways of improving potential growth, but critical way is to improve productivity. And there, the role of science, technology, and innovation just basically very, very large. Now, can emerging market developing economies take advantage of the kind of the changing digital technologies and innovate at home and promote their potential growth? That has to be seen. Even in advanced economies, what we have seen over the past 2 decades, despite the technological change, despite all these innovations around, there has been a decline in potential growth rates. Now, when you think about the broader challenge in advanced economies, that also reflected the kind of the legacies related to demographics, related to basically weak investment. But these challenges are increasingly manifesting themselves in emerging market developing economies. So it's becoming even more important to take advantage of changing technologies and improve productivity. What happened during the pandemic, of course, we basically end up using digital technologies in a much more intensive way if we did not have the pandemic. So today, probably 5, maybe 10 years ahead in terms of our ability to bring digital technologies into our lives because of the pandemic. The question is whether we will see a sustained improvement in productivity because of that. And basically, people are, in a sense, reaping the fruits of this technological changes and innovations and see the outcomes in potential growth. That is still a question we need to answer. And I think the time will tell us the best answer to that question. Let me turn to the third question raised by Professor Hirata. This is a very important issue. As important as this, the kind of how we think about technology and innovation. How do we think about developments in trade? Obviously, we saw a rapid integration of emerging market developing economies in the global economy that came with rapid trade growth relative to output growth. And we also saw during this period, prior to the global financial crisis, very fast rate of investment growth and very rapid spread of global supply chains. So Hideaki asked, what happened after the global financial crisis? Why momentum for trade integration, at least the kind of the trade growth slowed? There are multiple reasons. One reason, of course, global supply chains are somewhat matured. We documented these changes in the World Development Report. The previous one, the last one was on data, but the previous one was, of course, the global value chains. And another reason was that after the crisis, we saw a significant decline in growth of investment. When investment slows down, it's associated with a slowdown in trade because a big chunk of capital goods are traded across borders. Some of them are durable goods, and you see the kind of the slowdown. Another important reason was a slowdown in foreign direct investment, which is still basically with us. And when foreign direct investment slows down, that has implications for growth of trade as well. And I think it's fair to say that after the global financial crisis, there has been policy uncertainty, elevated level, somewhat higher than what we saw prior to the global financial crisis, and that also affected the ability of countries to make plans and trade, along with elevated debt levels we see in sovereigns and the corporates, the all together affecting trade outcomes. The second question Dr. Hirata asked, how do we think about these demand spillover effects from the advanced economies if the quicker vaccination takes place, because we see somewhat slower growth in trade. So these linkages are still there, and obviously trade growth rebounded significantly. It is already above the pre-crisis levels. The services trade is a big issue. So typically when people have a rapid increase in their incomes, like what we are seeing nowadays, they would like to go on vacation. They would like to consume the goods of services. And that creates, of course, cross-border trade. It is going to take some time to have that change, that type of spillover taking place. People are basically crossing the borders for vacation, crossing the borders to consume all types of goods while they are on vacation. And that will, of course, weigh heavily on some emerging market developing economies. They rely on trade, and a number of small states that rely on trade. Because of that, I mentioned that the small states growth relative to advanced economies growth in per capita terms going to be lower on average than what advanced economy is going to deliver in per capita terms. So there are reasons to expect that you are going to have spillovers because of the manufacturing trade, but there are reasons to expect that spillovers are going to be weaker, primarily because of the services trade, especially the tourist arrivals are going to be somewhat, challenged for the foreseeable future. Hopefully, we will see a different outcome if this rapid vaccination takes place and people are not going to be hesitant to cross the border and then have vacation in other places. But let me stop there. Back to you, Masato. Thank you.
Thank you, Naihan and Sugawara-san. I think we still have a little bit of time, so if I take advantage of my role as a moderator, may I ask a couple questions here? One is about inequality. Obviously, the World Bank Group has already announced that the trend of poverty reduction will unfortunately reverse due to this pandemic. With your economic focus and prospects in mind, how do you see the magnitude and the duration of this reversal, particularly when we think about not just across the border inequalities, I mean, you know, country versus another country, but also within border inequality? That will be a big problem. So that's my first question. And the second question is that those countries which are showing rapid recovery have employed active policy interventions, and it is argued that that kind of intervention will make more zombie players in the economy. And so over the long run, perhaps these active policy interventions may be a double-edged sword, so that they could instead drag down the productivity and innovation in the long run. So how would you see very long term that the currently recovering economies, how would they play out over the long term? Thank you.
Thank you, Masato. Let me try to briefly answer your questions, and then now I can add the first question about inequality, obviously critical, and what now and I presented here, suggesting when we think about inequality across countries, there are going to be deeper challenges there, given that we are seeing not convergence, in fact, divergence in incomes when we look at the per capita income growth rates. In the context of within country inequality, there are also significant challenges. And I think the one important challenge is that when you look at what segments of societies have been affected the most by the pandemic, you see the lower incomes, you see women, you see those unskilled, those in the informal sector. So they were already in a difficult place when it comes to income inequality. And I think during the pandemic, their positions have become even worse. Now, there are different ways of thinking about the magnitude of this problem. But like the poverty data, this inequality data comes with a lag. There is no question the inequality challenge today is larger than what we had prior to the crisis. In fact, this was the topic G7 leaders also discussed and emphasized the importance of overcoming the inequality challenge. Just not emerging market developing economies, even in advanced economies. And I think the point of departure we have when we think about the numbers, here we see this record rebound in global growth, but at the same time, those countries, they need to have the highest growth rates are delivering much lower growth rates than what they need in terms of closing the income gap with advanced economies. So the only thing I can tell you, the magnitude of this challenge is larger today than it was prior to the crisis. And second question you asked, I'm very happy you asked that question because we mentioned in passing when we discussed the risks, these corporate defaults. So what happened last year was quite remarkable. In a typical global recession, you expect a number of corporations to fail. That did not happen. The bankruptcies were not there. Why it did not happen? Because there were, of course, all types of support measures, including forbearance measures, the macroprudential measures, the loan extensions, the all types of mortgage moratoriums, and then there are direct support to firms. The question is, what will happen when governments withdraw these support programs? And I think we will see how resilient the corporate sector is around the world. In the World Bank, we are really worried about the corporate debt, which was already at record levels prior to the the pandemic crisis, and now, of course, it is much higher. And it has to be seen how corporations are going to react as governments and then the financial institutions, central banks withdraw these support measures. Obviously, they are going to do this in a very calibrated, gradual way. But then the question whether we might end up a number of zombie firms in some emerging market developing economies because somehow governments keep these support measures one way or another to support, to prolong the lives of these firms. In some cases, they can be large firms. And we know the consequences of that, huge implications for productivity growth and the long-term growth prospects. So it's going to be important for policymakers to carefully adjust their policies, not to prematurely basically delay the recovery, but at the same time, understand the consequences of protracted support policies when it comes to basically overall distortions in the economy and distortions in the balance sheets of these companies. And sometimes you come to a point, there is no point of departure, point of return. And unfortunately, at that point, you realize that the cost is much larger. You could have solved the problem at a much lower cost, but you delay the solution and you end up with a much larger cost. But we are ready to help countries to address these issues. Let me quickly turn to now, if he wants to add any additional points now.
Yeah, thank you. So let me add just the quick point for this for the first question on inequality within countries. It is important to emphasize that the pandemic has disproportionately affected disproportionately the vulnerable groups like women or unskilled workers or the workers in the informal economies. Unless those vulnerable groups are saved through, say, like social safety net or more like big reform packages, this is impact and the negative effect of the pandemic on the inequality remains. So it is important to implement those reforms to save these vulnerable groups so that inequality is going to be shrink over time. Thank you.
I would like to thank again Ahen Kose, Naotaka Sugawara, and Professor Sayuri Shirai for their wonderful contributions to today's seminar. And for the audience, thank you very much for joining us today. And as I said at the beginning, we are holding similar events on various subjects every week, mostly. So please come on and join us and enjoy the seminars. So thank you for your participation today. And I would like to close today's seminar. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Masato. Thank you, Dr. Shirai.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.